So I think that the voters, at least, are way ahead of the politicians, and they realize the folly of the drug war.
Good evening. Welcome to the How To Academy on Friday. I'm Robin Ince, and today we're going to be discussing this book. This is Your Mind on Plants by Michael Pollan, who has, you may well have read his other books such as How to Change Your Mind, Omnivore's Dilemma, or Botany of Desire, which I've just been rereading as well. Later on, we're going to have a Q&A. If you have any questions, just send them to the Q&A section, and we'll stop doing those in about 40 minutes. But any questions that come up from this conversation or about Michael's work in the past that you might know about, pop them there and we'll deal with as many as possible. But good evening to you all, and good evening or good morning, I suppose. Michael, how are you?
Good morning here in California. I'm very well, Robin. Very good to be here with you in the How To Academy.
Now, I have to ask you this first of all, because I know you're doing loads of publicity at the moment and loads of conversations. And Luke, who's producing this, said that you've just been on Joe Rogan. Now, everyone that I talk to, like talking to Brian Greene the other day, Joe Rogan will always find an excuse to somehow talk about hallucinogens, even if you're a string theorist. So I imagine he must have been
especially if you're a string theorist.
Yeah. Once he gets the quantum mechanics on, then you can imagine where that goes. But I would imagine that was an absolute kind of delight of exploration of these ideas.
You know, it was great fun. It's a very long podcast. It's like almost 3 hours, but he got some really good chairs in his studio, so it's bearable, you know, ergonomic chairs. You know, he's kind of a phenomenon. I mean, he can hold it wasn't clear to me he'd read the book, but he was able to talk about it for 3 hours. I think that's something impressive in that. But yeah, the Venn diagram of his interests, you know, mixed martial arts, libertarian politics, comedy, and psychedelics. I don't know that there's anybody who has those circles all crossing the way he does. So it was great fun. There's an excerpt from it on caffeine that he posted on YouTube that if you don't have 3 hours, just check that part out.
Well, that's it, because in the book, which obviously deals with three things, which is opium, caffeine, and then mescaline. And you actually went through. You showed me just before we started doing this. You are having coffee now, but
I am back on the wagon. Yes.
Went through coffee withdrawal though.
Yeah, well, my reason for, so I quit cold turkey to understand caffeine. One of the researchers I interviewed, a man named Roland Griffith, who is also a prominent psychedelic researcher, but he made his name studying caffeine. He said, you're never going to understand your relationship to a drug that you're involved with on a daily basis unless you get off it and really see what its power is in your life. So it was kind of a challenge that I had to accept. And normally in my drug journalism, I'm trying drugs. And this time I was not trying drugs. I was trying not to take it. And my intent the whole time was to get back on. In fact, I eagerly look forward to, you know, having a cup of coffee as a caffeine virgin. And it was mind-blowing experience. But it was very hard being off caffeine for 3 months. The first week was, you know, no concentration whatsoever, just felt completely scattered. I felt like I had acquired attention deficit disorder. The periphery, you know, just kept intruding on my thoughts, and writing was out of the question, which, you know, writing requires concentration, you know, the narrowing of experience to that linear line of the sentence. No way I could do that. And I felt like I had this veil that had come down between me and reality. Everything was kind of fogged, and I didn't have the headaches, I didn't have the flu-like symptoms people report, but I really didn't like how I felt. And what was astonishing is that even after 2 months had gone by, I still didn't feel quite myself. And that made me wonder, like, what does that mean? Does that mean myself is a caffeinated self? Is that's my baseline consciousness? And I think it is. I've been using caffeine since I was 10 years old. It's normal for me, and being off it was abnormal, and I didn't much like it.
How much of that do you think could be psychosomatic? I think of things like, I remember a friend of mine's teenage son who drank 5 bottles of a juice drink called J2O, which he hadn't realized was non-alcoholic, and then was incredibly drunk for the next 8 hours. And I think with a lot of drugs, both legal and illegal, that there is part of the ceremony of it, part of the ritual,
Yeah.
sometimes means that we're persuaded of its necessity or the change in our mind.
It's incredible how much of drug experience is constructed, and that I think most of us who've had psychedelic experience have been influenced in one way or another by Aldous Huxley and Doors of Perception, and our expectation of the psychedelic experience shapes it to a large extent, and that's probably true of all drugs. Context is very important. People can have an incredible variety of different experiences depending on what they think it's about. Like, psychedelic experience has a very Eastern flavor. What is that about? Why was it constructed as kind of, in the Buddhist side of things? Or it was because Huxley was very interested in Eastern religion, and Timothy Leary too, and he used the Tibetan Book of the Dead as his model for psychedelic experience. But they were New World psychedelics that were kind of ignored for a while, and those have a very different tone. And so I think it's constructed by the individual, and it's constructed by the culture to some extent. There's nothing in that mushroom except a catalyst. Everything else is produced by your mind, and your mind is going to use ingredients from its experience, its expectations. So yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I think that caffeine is kind of wired into my daily experience, my rituals. We are very habitual creatures. I remember when I gave up cigarettes, and I had smoked cigarettes for a couple of years in my early 20s. I also couldn't write for a while because the process of writing a sentence and taking a drag and having a sip of coffee, it was all of a package. It was the cues my brain needed to produce the next sentence, and so I had to relearn writing without cigarettes, and I had to relearn writing on chamomile tea, which really sucked.
Yeah, about 10 years ago, I gave up drinking, smoking, and coffee all at the same time.
Ugh.
Because I knew that once I was allowed to drink coffee and alcohol again, to hell with the cigarettes. I thought it was a way of me going, do you know what? 2 out of 3 is fine, but it was hell in terms of focus. And that's one of the things that interests me. There's a line, I forget who wrote about the Apollo astronauts, and said that going to the moon didn't change them. It allowed them to be who they really were. It gave them permission from that point onwards. And I wonder how, and of course, that is a dangerous thing when we talk about hallucinogens. That is great if the thing you're freeing up in your mind is something that's going to be positive or change your perception in a good way, but it might also be that you are fearful of what is in your mind. So how much do you think things like hallucinogens and other drugs play that part of giving permission?
Yeah, look, our minds are very scary places to visit. And I think that that's part of people's reluctance to use psychedelics. It was certainly mine. Like, I didn't know what would turn up. Maybe there was some childhood trauma. Maybe there was some really ugliness that I didn't want to confront. So I think we all deal with that. And psychedelics can take you to really unpleasant places, and you might learn things about yourself you don't like. But I think that many people do come out of the experience feeling more themselves, changed, but also more themselves in the same way the astronauts did. There are actually some interesting parallels with the experience of being in space and psychedelic trips. The overview effect, this new kind of planetary consciousness that some of the astronauts have reported, is just seeing life from as if the camera were pulled back much further on the scene of human life or on the scene of your own life. Those perspectives, which can change everything, have been occasioned by space travel and also by psychedelic experience. It really is about moving the camera. It's not changing the life necessarily, but moving the camera angle, and that can be revolutionary for somebody.
Well, that's a little bit about in the first essay in the book, which some of it is I think, is it 1997?
Yeah, it was published originally in 1997. Yeah.
And you actually say in that you just not really have the leisure time to do, you know, some of these. So it's interesting to me that, having also read How to Change Your Mind, you know, at what point did you go, do you know what, I've now got enough space just in case my mind isn't quite working right tomorrow from whatever I take? When did that opportunity start?
Well, it was actually different for me. It's so weird. If I can call something work, I find time for it. And so once I decided to write How to Change Your Mind, having a couple psychedelic experiences became part of my reporting. So I made time for it. It wasn't a leisure activity by any means, because I was very nervous about doing it. And so it was research. It truly was research for me, even though it had lots of personal ramifications. So yeah, I did chuckle when I read that line in the piece from '96, where I'm a father with a house and a mortgage, and I don't have time for drug experience, and I didn't then. But when I redefined them as work, I did.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think last time we talked a little bit about Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine, where he says, I've reached an age now where I can do all these things, because everyone else, they've got freedom. I'm not in charge of them. Let's try everything.
Well, you know, when you have kids still at home, finding space and time for psychedelics is definitely complicated. And my interest, you know, ended. It didn't begin until my son was out of the house, and because it's just I mean, there's the time issue, and there's it just doesn't go with child rearing. I mean, people, you know, have this conversation with their kids, and I did talk to my son quite a bit about drugs over the years and how to think about them, but it's those two things don't go together very easily. So yeah, and I do think also psychedelics have particular relevance as we get older. There's a throwaway line in the book that psychedelics may be wasted on the young. And, you know, I know lots of young people who had valuable psychedelic experience, but sometimes it was just a drug experience, you know, it was a thrill, it was interesting, but the meaningfulness of it that adults or people who are older find, and also the ways in which psychedelics allow us to break through old habits of thought, old habits of behavior, I think is really their great value. I mean, as time goes on, we get really stuck in our ways, and we have these, you know, we run these algorithms for every situation in life, and it's incredibly efficient. We know how to argue with our spouse, and we know how to deal with an employer, and we know how to negotiate with our children, and we play these tapes, and they're great for getting stuff done, but they also kind of blind us to experience and fresh thought and the senses. So that is what I found psychedelics were really useful for just kind of scrubbing the glass and seeing things freshly and acquiring new perspectives, all of which is harder the older you get.
I find that interesting because I think for a lot of people, the idea, what they would imagine drugs to be, both legal and illegal, very often is an escape from something. But I think more and more people that I speak to who are going, oh, it's not, it's rather than escaping from reality, it's trying to find a new perception of reality, which immediately changes the relationship you're going to have with it, I presume.
Yeah, it does. And well, first of all, I think it's hard to generalize about all drugs. I mean, one of the problems of the drug war is it puts all these very different substances in the same basket and says these are bad drugs, these are illicit drugs, these are tools of escape. And that may be true for some of them, but it's certainly not true of the psychedelics. Psychedelic experience is hard work, especially as you're older. And, you know, if you go into it with a sense of intention, you're going to really work hard because you're going to be dealing with difficult material. It can be frightening at times. You're exhausted when it's over. You feel like you've run a marathon. At least that was my experience. So I didn't. It was the opposite of escape. Daily life is the escape. You know, where we go through life without dealing with difficult issues and without examining ourselves. We just, you know, we run the programs. So yeah, the escapist trope, I think, is all wrong for psychedelics. Is it true for opiates? Maybe. You know, there's a lot of self-medication that goes on with addictive drugs like the opiates. It's also about pleasure, though, and we don't ever mention that. Drug warriors don't talk about the fact that people use drugs because it gives them pleasure. And for some people who live in really difficult circumstances, it's one of the few pleasures available to them. And they're willing to, take the risk that goes with it. But we don't consider pleasure a legitimate reason to use a drug. Although, with alcohol, we're okay with it. I mean, it's just another example of, how arbitrary some of these distinctions are between different substances we use to change consciousness. Yeah, escapism doesn't sound right. The drugs they all need to be looked at on their own terms. They do such different things. I mean, you have drugs like caffeine and cocaine that are really kind of ego reinforcers. And then you have psychedelics that are ego dissolvers. That's one distinction. That you have ones that numb us and the ones that sharpen us. You have ones that give us more what the psychologists call spotlight consciousness, and that's certainly caffeine, right? It allows us to really block out things and focus. And then you have drugs that give us more lantern consciousness, bring in information from all sides, much more in the manner of children and how they perceive the world. And psychedelics, I think, fall into that class, mescaline in particular, I think. The generalities are a problem. And one of the benefits of ending the drug war, which I hope we do soon, and there's some evidence, I think, at least in the United States, that it is coming to a conclusion, will be to we need to look at each of these on their own terms. And what are they good for and what are they bad for? Could they be legitimate tools, or are they just dangerous? And I think that conversation is going to require a lot of nuance.
See, how much have you managed to get a greater understanding? Because the drug war to me is such. I mean, I don't know if it started by Nixon. I remember
Nixon in 1970, just 50 years ago.
And you've got him being, I think Elvis was given a drug enforcement agent, badge, and now there's a guy with a big pharmacy list.
Yeah, I know.
But
bad choice for your drug enforcement guy.
Except he would definitely have said he was against drugs, wouldn't he? This is the thing that I find so intriguing, and we can get further on to talk about OxyContin and things as well, which is in your first essay. But that bit of trying to understand the cognitive dissonance required to allow an enormous amount of sometimes very damaging drugs out there, or as you say, at one point you were worried about growing poppies, and yet you could have gone into a shop and bought an AK-47.
Yeah,
that's a real, and every time I try and get my head around our attitude to what is a war against drugs and what is something which is a necessary freedom, I can't manage to get the seesaw to work.
When we have the perspective of history, the drug war is going to look absurd in many ways, and there are many absurdities you can point to. But Nixon, there's a passage in the book where I quote from an interview that John Ehrlichman, who was Nixon's domestic policy advisor, I mean, one of his top aides, someone who went to jail for the Watergate crimes, explained to a journalist what was really behind the drug war, which Nixon did start. And he said, his candor and cynicism was just breathtaking in this quote. And he said, the Nixon administration had two enemies, hippies and blacks. And we knew if we demonized their drugs, we would have a cudgel to beat them with. We would be able to come into their communities at will and disrupt them. And we would be able to essentially criminalize them. And so we went after cannabis, which was being used a lot by African Americans, and psychedelics being used a lot by hippies. And that's what it was about. It was never about the drugs. So the drug war was sold to us as a public health campaign, right? We have to do this for our health. This is destroying young minds. But in fact, it was a political campaign. And, to a large extent, the United States imposed it on many other countries by forcing everybody to sign these drug treaties, and which is making it difficult for them to get off the train now. And many countries would like to. But it is coming, I think, there are signs that it's coming to an end in America, and which is, I'm very encouraged by. 2020 election, we had 5 states decriminalize cannabis, bringing the total to 18, where cannabis is legal, sold legally. We had ballot initiatives in Oregon, the state of Oregon, to decriminalize all drugs, personal possession of even hard drugs, and people who are arrested are channeled into treatment rather than incarcerated. And then we had a ballot initiative also in Oregon to specifically legalize psilocybin therapy, magic mushroom therapy, that will obligate the state's Department of Health to train and certified guides, psychedelic guides, and licensed growers of magic mushrooms. And a bunch of other places have already decriminalized what they call plant medicines or entheogens, which are plant-based psychedelics. So I think that the voters, at least, are way ahead of the politicians, and they realize the folly of the drug war. They realize it's, the collateral damage has been so bad. I mean, in terms of incarcerating people of color who have really been the focus of the drug war. And also, the damage it's done to countries like Mexico and Colombia by empowering the cartels. It's done so much damage, and, it hasn't worked. We have a bigger drug problem today than we did when we started it, largely because of legal opiates. So at the same time that the government has been chasing down people using drugs illegally, the FDA approved Oxycontin, which you mentioned earlier, which really, seeded the modern opioid crisis, which last year killed 93,000 people in the US. And again, that begins with legal opiates. So I think that fact, that historical irony, that while we were, using the law to deal with illicit drugs, the pharmaceutical industry was hooking huge numbers of people on opiates. I think that's taken a lot of credibility out of the drug war, and that's one of the reasons the public is turning against it.
Well, that's what I mean. Your first essay, which is you basically being worried that you're going to become a drug outlaw, and just for making opium tea, which is, as you say, kind of is one of those things which, when drunk, can remove some of the existential burden of being human as drunk and funeral. So, for those who don't know about this, can you give us, because this is a fascinating thing where for the first time ever the full article is published, and you include what was removed for your genuine fear that this could lead to incarceration.
Yes, and the loss of my home, and because under the asset forfeiture laws, if your property is guilty of growing a controlled substance, even if you're not convicted or tied to that, even if your kid plants a marijuana plant in the corner of your garden and you don't know about it, they can take your house. The damage to our civil liberties has been profound. So that story began in 1996, and I was writing about gardening. That was I did columns for Harper's Magazine, New York Times Magazine, and my editor sent me this underground press book called Opium for the Masses by a man named Jim Hogshire. And he was explaining how, and I've got some right here, you can grow poppies. These are the poppy heads. And you can turn those poppy heads into a mild narcotic by making tea from them.